This is the story of a university student who, when she started university, had everything going for her. She was a high achiever and she'd come from a very normal, supportive and stable family. In fact, her parents were still very much in love even after years of marriage. Things really didn't seem like they could get any better for this family, but in March of 2020, something went horrifically wrong that would fracture this family so badly that there would be no going back. Hi, my name's Yasmin and I make videos about topics that are scary, disturbing or true crime, so if you'd like to, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up and we'll get on with the rest of the story. Sydney Powell was born in Akron, Ohio to parents Steve and Brenda Powell. She also had a brother named Andrew and together they were a very tight-knit family. Sydney was very close to her mother Brenda in particular, and she had this amazing support system growing up, which meant that she did very well both academically and athletically. In fact, Sydney's high school grades were so outstanding that she ended up getting a scholarship to attend Mount Union University in 2018. Her mother Brenda played a huge role in supporting Sydney throughout her childhood and schooling life to make this happen in the first place. Brenda just sounded like a gem of a person, to be honest. She was loved by so many people because she was just such a naturally empathetic person, which made her very successful in her workplace as well. Brenda worked as a child life specialist at Akron Children's Hospital, which is where she interacted with children who were diagnosed with cancer, and she would help in their journey both mentally and physically. Brenda was just naturally someone who had this aura of comfort and understanding surrounding her, whether that was directed towards her family members or sick children and their families. Sydney and Brenda's relationship changed a little bit when Sydney had to move away for university. It was a bit of an adjustment for both of them, but university was only about an hour's drive away, so it really wasn't too bad. Sydney ended up moving into a dorm room with her friend Lauren Curry, and the semester actually started off pretty good. As the semester progressed, Sydney was starting to run into a little bit of trouble. She was struggling with just the sheer amount of work, and this started to affect her grades. Now, her grades were visible to anyone who had access to her username and password on this university app or portal type thing, and her parents did actually have access to this, but they never checked it because Sydney had always been a good student. Why would things be different now that she was at university? In 2019, Sydney came home for a break from uni and everything seemed perfectly normal by then. She was spending Christmas and New Year's with her family and just seemed to be having a great time while she was on this break. She even got a part-time job to help her just save a little bit of money so that she had some pocket money when she went back to uni. But Sydney had this deep, dark secret that she was hiding from everyone in her life. No one was suspecting anything apart from her mother, Brenda. So Brenda was so attuned to her daughter that she just knew something wasn't right. She could sense that something was bothering Sydney. In fact, when Sydney returned back to university, her mum sent a text to her saying, "Why do I always feel like you're scamming me? Just remember, you need to keep your good grades if you want to keep your scholarship." And in response to this, Sydney replied with, "My grades are good, thank you very much." And that was just the extent of the conversation. They didn't really elaborate at all. During this time, Steve, Sydney's dad, was trying to log into that university portal. And the reason why he was doing this is because Sydney's scholarship only covered a partial amount of the university fees, so her dad had to log in to just see how much of the payments were due for him to make. But he was putting in the same password and username that he'd always used, but this message just kept popping up saying that there was no access to the account. So he approached Sydney about it and said, do you know anything about this? And Sydney just sort of brushed it off and she was like, "Oh, I'm sure it's fine. It's probably just like a glitch in the system or something. Just try again later." But Steve tried again and again He just couldn't get in. So he actually ended up calling the university admissions office to reset the login. The admin office couldn't really give many details without Sydney's permission, but they said something that totally shocked her dad, and he was just not expecting it because Sydney had given no indication of this. The woman on the phone said that Sydney was no longer a student there, and she hasn't been for the entire semester. Sydney had actually failed 4 of her subjects that semester, which meant that she was no longer able to get her scholarship. And this also meant that she was also no longer able to attend university or live in the residence. So where had she been this entire time? Sydney had failed 4 of her subjects that semester, which meant that she could no longer get her scholarship and that she was no longer able to attend university or live at the university residence. So what had she been doing this entire time that she was away from her family? After Sydney was evicted from her accommodation, she started living in hotels to buy some time to make it seem like she was away studying. She was too ashamed to ever admit that she'd been kicked out of uni, but she also wasn't accepting it herself. Steve was totally confused as to what had even been going on this whole semester. So he logged into that Find My Friends app on his phone. He rarely used it, but he had all his family members on it and only really logged in to just see where his family was in emergency situations. And to his surprise, Sydney wasn't an hour away. She was at their house. So to not raise any suspicion, Steve just calmly left his phone at work just in case Sydney was also tracking where her family members were, and he made the way over to their house. He pulled up into the driveway and he could see that Sydney's car was also there. When he came home, he found Sydney sitting alone on the couch and gently approached her as to what she was actually doing at home and what about going to class. Sydney admitted that she was struggling at university and that she was still going, but she was just having a really hard time. And Steve was super supportive. He said that it was totally okay to feel like this, to feel like she was overwhelmed. And it's okay to take some time off. But he couldn't really sit with her for too long because he had to go back to work. So he ended up calling his wife, Brenda, to come over and just spend some time with Sydney because obviously she was very upset and she needed someone to be there with her. So of course Brenda left work to be with her daughter so that she could support her at home and just, talk things through and just see what she was going through. When she got there initially, she was very understanding, but at the same time, she had this niggly feeling that something just wasn't right still. She wanted to hear it from the university herself as to what was happening. And she called them at around midday, and the admin office was actually shut for lunchtime. So once the university staff had come back, they did return Brenda's call, and this was around 12:36 p.m. Brenda was able to answer the phone, but she really wasn't able to say much else. All the university staff could hear over the phone was just a series of loud, repetitive thuds that was coming from Brenda's end, and also a gut-wrenching series of screams, as if someone was dying or just being attacked. The people on the phone were asking if Brenda was okay and what was going on, but all they got in response was more screaming. The phone just abruptly hung up from Brenda's end. They tried to call back and there was no answer, so they tried again. And at 12:40, someone picked up the phone claiming that they were Brenda, but the voice was completely different. The school admin knew that this was in fact Sydney, and they did confront Sydney about it, but Sydney was basically like, I don't know what you're talking about, this is Brenda speaking, and she was just insistent that it was Brenda. But they knew that she was lying. So they called the police to see what was actually happening in the house, because why couldn't Brenda get back on the phone? Why was there screaming? When the police arrived at the family home, Sydney was crawling on her hands and feet along the driveway. Her fingers were split open and bleeding all over her hands from the gravel that she was on, and her eyes were just rolling into the back of her head. She was quickly taken away from the scene, and it triggered this catatonic episode where she was just lying on the ground in a fetal position, unable to communicate or speak to anyone around her. Brenda was found upstairs in the master bedroom of their house. She was in critical condition with life-threatening injuries all over her body, particularly her head. Brenda was immediately rushed to a medical center, but sadly she did pass away from her injuries. Her injuries were caused by repetitive beatings to her head with a heavy cast iron pan, and she also had 23 stab wounds around her neck that were caused by a kitchen knife. Once Sydney was stabilized in hospital, she was asked about one of the broken windows in her house, and she mentioned that someone broke into their home, but everything clearly looked staged to police. Sydney was taken to trial, and her attorneys claimed that she was actually in a psychotic state when this all happened, and she had no recollection of the entire event until she was in hospital after the attack. And they backed this up with the fact that 3 psychologists diagnosed her with schizophrenia, which was not previously diagnosed, and that it was clear that she was in a psychotic state because she couldn't even accept the fact that she was unenrolled from university. Now, according to Sydney, she was hearing voices that day, and these voices were saying that she was a loser and that she was worthless. But the prosecution, on the other hand, stated that Sydney was mentally fit enough because she had clearly staged the crime scene. She had the foresight to do this, and she was pretending to have a mental illness. Sydney was ultimately found guilty for the murder of her mum, and on the 28th of September 2023, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. That was the case of Sydney Powell. If you find topics like this interesting, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I post every single week, so I will see you in the next video. Bye.